The 16th of December, 1944. Freezing fog over the Ardennes Forest, Belgium. A British medic named Private Edward Bennett stood in a field hospital tent, his frostbitten hands shaking, his mind numb with exhaustion after 3 months of treating casualties from the liberation of Europe. He had just been told he was going home. Medical discharge. Honourable. His shrapnel wounds from Normandy had never healed properly, and the doctors said he'd done enough. But when the first wounded American GIs stumbled through the tent flaps at dawn, something strange happened. No organised retreat, no orderly evacuation, just the sound of artillery getting closer and German voices shouting in the forest. Edward didn't understand. None of the medical staff did. The war was nearly over. Germany was beaten. Why were panthers and tigers suddenly rolling through the snow toward them? That moment would change everything he believed about endings, about safety, and about what happens when desperate men make one final, impossible gamble. Because in those frozen forests of the Ardennes, Germany was fighting its last great offensive. Not with the strength of 1940, but with something far more dangerous, the fury of the dying. And what happened next would force Edward to choose between the discharge papers in his pocket and the screaming men in the snow, between going home to his family or staying in the coldest, bloodiest winter battle of the entire war. Stay till the end to see how one British medic's reprieve became a nightmare that would define the Battle of the Bulge, and how a man too broken to fight became the reason hundreds survived. And don't forget to subscribe, like, and share this video to support our channel and help us tell more forgotten stories of history that deserve to be remembered. It was the first week of June somewhere over Normandy. The sky was grey and full of smoke. The smell of seawater and cordite filled the landing craft. Edward Bennett, a 27-year-old British Army medic from Liverpool, had been training for this invasion for 18 months. The Higgins boat beneath him pitched with each wave. His medical kit felt impossibly heavy on his back. When the ramp dropped, there was no time to think. Men ran forward into machine gun fire. Bodies fell into the surf, turning the water red. Edward moved between them, dragging wounded soldiers behind cover, pressing bandages against holes that wouldn't stop bleeding. A mortar exploded 10 feet from him. The concussion threw him against a tank obstacle. When he woke, his left side was full of shrapnel, his uniform soaked with blood. He couldn't tell if it was his or someone else's. He had grown up hearing that medics were protected, that the Red Cross armband meant something, that even in war there were rules. But on that beach, rules meant nothing. Death came for everyone equally. So when he felt the hot pain spreading through his ribs, his first thought was simple. Get up. Keep moving. More men are dying. The irony came fast. The soldiers he saved pulled him to safety. They dragged him inland, away from the killing zone, and called for a medic to treat the medic. One corporal, his name stitched on his uniform, Fletcher, pressed a field dressing against Edward's side and said, "You're going home, mate. You've done your bit." Edward didn't believe it. Not yet. They loaded him onto a medical transport. The smell of antiseptic and gangrene filled the air. Wounded men lay on stretchers, moaning or silent. Edward stared at the canvas ceiling, feeling the truck bounce over the cratered roads, and realised the war was no longer something he controlled. It was happening to him now. For the first few days, pain was stronger than thought. He drifted in and out of consciousness in a field hospital near Bayeux. Surgeons removed most of the shrapnel, but couldn't get all of it. Too close to vital organs, too risky. "You'll carry some of it for life," a doctor told him, "but you'll live." They gave him morphine for the pain, antibiotics for the infection, and told him he'd be evacuated to England within a week. Medical discharge was almost certain. His war was over. He heard other patients whisper, "Lucky bastard." One said, "I'd take shrapnel if it meant going home." That night, a chaplain came by with forms. He spoke gently, asking about Edward's family, his injuries, his plans. When Edward said he had a wife in Liverpool, the chaplain smiled. "She'll be glad to have you back." Edward didn't know it then, but those words would haunt him for the rest of his life. Outside, the Allied advance pushed deeper into France. By July 1944, more than 850,000 Allied soldiers were fighting across Normandy. Casualties mounted daily. Medical facilities were overwhelmed. Every doctor, every nurse, every medic was desperately needed. When Edward's infection cleared enough for him to sit up, he started helping around the field hospital, changing bandages, holding hands, writing letters for men who couldn't. The doctors noticed. One surgeon, a major named Pemberton, pulled him aside. "Bennett, you should be resting." "I've been resting for 3 weeks, sir," Edward replied. "These men need help." Pemberton studied him for a moment. "Your discharge papers are being processed. You'll be home by September." "Yes, sir." But something in Edward's chest twisted when he said it. The guilt of leaving while others stayed. At night, he couldn't sleep. Pain medication made him drowsy, but the sounds kept him awake. Men crying for mothers, for morphine, for God. The artillery rumbling in the distance, the endless stream of ambulances bringing fresh casualties. He thought of his wife, Mary, waiting in Liverpool, about the letter he'd written saying he was wounded but alive. About the baby they'd planned to have after the war. He prayed quietly, not for healing, but for purpose. When the papers finally came in August, Edward held them in his hands and felt nothing. No relief, no joy, just emptiness, honourable discharge, medical grounds, effective immediately. Major Pemberton shook his hand. "You've done your duty, Bennett. Go home. Be with your family." "Yes, sir," Edward said. But he didn't leave. Not yet. He told himself he'd stay 1 more week, help train his replacement, make sure the transition was smooth. 1 week became 2. 2 became a month. By September, the Allies were pushing toward Germany. The field hospital moved east, following the advance. Edward moved with it, still not officially reassigned, still technically discharged, but unable to walk away from men who were dying. The medical staff accepted his presence without question. They needed every hand they could get. One night, a nurse named Alice asked him, "Why are you still here?" Edward didn't have a good answer. "Because if I leave, who treats them?" "Someone else," Alice said. "There's always someone else." But Edward shook his head. Not always. Not enough. By November, they'd reached Belgium. The weather turned bitter. Rain became sleet, became snow. The field hospital set up in a monastery near the German border, treating casualties from the advance toward the Siegfried Line. Edward's shrapnel wounds ached in the cold. Some days the pain was so bad he could barely move, but he kept working. Changing dressings, splinting fractures, holding pressure on arterial bleeds while surgeons operated. Pemberton pulled him aside again in late November. "Bennett, I've been informed your discharge papers were never processed. Technically, you're AWOL." Edward's stomach dropped. "Sir, I'm fixing it," Pemberton interrupted. "I'm putting you back on active duty, effective immediately." "But Edward, listen to me. You need to go home. Your body can't take much more of this." "I know, sir." "Do you?" Pemberton's voice was sharp. "Because from where I stand, you look like a man with a death wish." Edward had no answer for that. The papers were reprocessed. Medical discharge, again. Effective December 20th, 1944. He'd be home for Christmas. 5 more weeks. He could manage 5 more weeks. But then came December 16th, and everything changed. The attack began at dawn with the sound of thunder. Except it wasn't thunder. It was the largest German artillery barrage since 1940. Over 1,600 guns firing simultaneously along an 85-mile front. The monastery shook. Dust fell from the ceiling. Outside, the horizon glowed orange with explosions. Edward stumbled out of his tent, still pulling on his coat, and saw chaos. American soldiers were streaming back from the front lines, not retreating in order but running, panicked, bleeding. One GI collapsed at Edward's feet, his uniform soaked with blood. "They came out of nowhere," the soldier gasped. Tigers! Panthers! Hundreds of them! Edward pressed a bandage against the man's thigh. Where? Everywhere, the GI said. The whole fucking line. They're breaking through. Within an hour, the field hospital was overwhelmed. Wounded Americans filled every bed, every stretcher, every available space. More kept coming. The stories they told were terrifying. A massive German counter-offensive, 3 armies, over 200,000 soldiers, driving west toward Antwerp, trying to split the Allied forces in half. It was impossible. Germany was beaten. Everyone said so. But impossible or not, it was happening. Pemberton gathered the medical staff. His face was grim. We're evacuating. German advance units are 15 miles away and closing fast. Pack essential supplies. We move in 30 minutes. The staff scrambled. Edward helped load morphine, plasma, surgical instruments. Around him, wounded men watched with terrified eyes. There were too many to move. Some would have to be left behind. One American sergeant, both legs shattered, grabbed Edward's arm. Don't leave us, please. The Germans, they'll... He didn't finish. Everyone had heard the stories about what happened to wounded soldiers left behind. Usually nothing. Geneva Convention protected them. But these were SS units leading the attack. SS didn't always follow rules. Pemberton was making the terrible calculations. We can take 50 men, the most critical. The rest... He didn't finish. Edward looked at the room full of wounded. Over 100 men, young, scared, bleeding. And he thought about his discharge papers, about Mary, about Liverpool and safety and the life waiting for him. He thought about walking away, going home, letting someone else handle this. But he couldn't. Sir, Edward said quietly, I'm staying. Pemberton turned. What? I'm staying, with the wounded. Someone needs to be here when the Germans arrive, to advocate for them, to treat them. Bennett, that's suicide. If the SS find wounded men alone, they're dead, Edward interrupted. If they find wounded men with a British medic treating them, maybe they follow Geneva. Maybe not, but it's a chance. Pemberton stared at him. You'll be a prisoner if you survive. I know, sir. There was a long silence. Then Pemberton reached into his pack and pulled out Edward's discharge papers. He held them for a moment, then handed them over. For what it's worth, you've earned these 100 times over. Edward took the papers, folded them carefully, and put them in his breast pocket, right over his heart, where the shrapnel still lived. I'll see you after the war, sir. Pemberton nodded, his eyes wet. Godspeed, Bennett. The evacuation convoy left 20 minutes later. Edward watched the trucks disappear into the snow, carrying Pemberton, Alice, and the 50 men they could save. Then he turned back to the monastery. To the 100 men they couldn't. To the German army approaching through the frozen forest. And he got to work. The Germans arrived 2 hours later. Edward heard the engines first, deep, mechanical growls that made the ground tremble. Then came the squeak of tank treads on snow. He stood in the monastery doorway, Red Cross armband clearly visible, hands raised, as 3 Panther tanks rolled into the courtyard. Wehrmacht infantry followed. 40 or 50 men, weapons ready, eyes scanning for threats. An officer dismounted from the lead tank. Hauptmann, a captain. He approached Edward slowly, pistol drawn, but pointed at the ground. Who are you? He asked in German-accented English. Private Edward Bennett, British Army Medical Corps. I'm treating wounded American soldiers inside, all non-combatants. All under Geneva Convention protection. The Hauptmann studied him for a long moment. Then he holstered his pistol. You stayed behind? Someone had to. The officer nodded slowly. You are either very brave or very foolish. Probably both, sir. The Hauptmann almost smiled. Then he turned to his men and gave orders in rapid German. Soldiers moved into the monastery, weapons lowered but ready. Edward followed, his heart pounding. The Wehrmacht soldiers moved through the rooms, checking corners, securing the building. When they saw the wounded Americans, they stopped. One young German private, no older than 19, stared at a GI with half his face bandaged. The private whispered something that sounded like a prayer. The Hauptmann stood in the centre of the main hall, surveying the scene. Over 100 wounded men. Bandages soaked with blood, the smell of infection and fear. He turned to Edward. "How many can walk?" "Maybe 20. The rest need stretchers." "We have no stretchers." "Then they stay here," Edward said firmly. "With me. I'll continue treating them." The Hauptmann considered this. Then he said, "I will leave 2 of my men to guard them. And you. When our medical corps catches up, they will take over. Until then," he gestured to the wounded, "they are your responsibility." "Thank you, sir." "Don't thank me," the Hauptmann said quietly. "We're retreating back to Germany. We'll hold this area 2 days, maybe 3. Then the Americans will retake it. If you and these men are still alive, then—" He shrugged. "Geneva Convention works both ways." Then he was gone. His units moved west, toward the fighting. Edward was left with 2 Wehrmacht guards, neither of whom spoke English, and 100 wounded Americans who couldn't believe what had just happened. The next 3 days were the longest of Edward's life. The cold was brutal. The monastery had no heat. They burned furniture for warmth, wrapped wounded men in every blanket they could find. Men shivered despite fevers. Frostbite competed with bullet wounds for deadliest threat. Edward worked without stopping, changing dressings, rationing morphine, amputating fingers and toes that had frozen black. The 2 German guards helped. One, whose name Edward learned was Franz, had been a medical student before the war. He assisted with surgeries, holding limbs while Edward cut. The other, Klaus, kept the fires burning and fetched water from a well that hadn't frozen yet. On the second day, an SS patrol arrived. Edward's blood went cold. SS officers in their black uniforms stepped into the monastery, weapons drawn, faces hard. The leader, an Obersturmführer, looked at the wounded Americans with contempt. "Why are these men still alive?" he asked in German. Franz answered before Edward could, speaking rapidly, explaining the Geneva Convention, the promise of the Wehrmacht Hauptmann. The SS officer listened, unmoved. Then he turned to Edward. "You are British?" "Yes, sir." "A medic?" "Yes, sir." The SS officer studied him for a long moment. Then he said something in German that made Franz's face go white. Edward didn't understand the words, but he understood the tone. This was a death sentence. Franz stepped forward, speaking urgently. An argument erupted. The SS officer shouted. Franz shouted back. Klaus joined in. For several minutes, 3 Germans argued about whether to execute a British medic and 100 American wounded. Finally, the SS officer spat on the floor, gave a disgusted gesture, and left. His patrol followed. Edward stood there, shaking. Not from cold, but from the nearness of death. "What did you say?" he asked Franz. Franz looked at him with haunted eyes. "I told him that if he killed you, I would report him for war crimes, that Geneva Convention is still law even if we're losing." "And he listened?" "No," Franz said. Klaus threatened to report him to the Wehrmacht Hauptmann. SS hates Wehrmacht. They won't risk a jurisdiction fight. Edward understood. He'd been saved by German military politics, by the fracture between Wehrmacht and SS, by the fact that even in the depths of winter and defeat, some structures still held. That night, he wrote a letter to Mary. He didn't know if he'd ever send it, but he needed to write it. "My dearest Mary," he began. "If you're reading this, it means I didn't make it home. I'm sorry. I know I promised. I know you've been waiting. But there are men here who need help, and I couldn't leave them. Please understand. Please forgive me." He folded the letter and put it in his pocket next to his discharge papers. 2 pieces of paper, one representing the life he'd chosen to leave, one representing the life he'd never have. Both equally precious, both equally impossible. On the third day, American forces counterattacked. Edward heard the familiar sound of Sherman tanks, of American voices shouting coordinates, of 50 caliber machine guns laying down covering fire. The Wehrmacht guards, Franz and Klaus, looked at each other. They knew what was coming. Klaus spoke to Franz in German. Franz nodded. Then they both removed their helmets and placed their rifles on the ground. "We surrender," Franz said to Edward. "To you, as medical personnel." Edward stared at them. "I'm not authorized." "You're all we have," Franz said simply. "We saved you from the SS. You save us from your army." It was elegant logic. Cruel, but fair. Edward nodded. "All right. You're my prisoners." When American GIs burst through the monastery doors, weapons ready, they found a scene that would be photographed and written about in military journals for decades. A British medic with a Red Cross armband. 2 unarmed Wehrmacht soldiers standing with hands raised. And over 100 wounded American soldiers, alive against all odds, lying on stretchers in a frozen monastery. The American captain in charge, a man named Henderson, took one look and lowered his rifle. "What the hell happened here?" Edward's voice was hoarse from exhaustion. "We survived, sir. That's what happened." Henderson walked among the wounded, checking faces, counting heads. Finally, he turned back to Edward. "How many did you lose?" 11. Infection, blood loss, cold. I couldn't save them all." "Jesus," Henderson whispered. "But you saved 90, in the middle of a German offensive with no supplies." "I had help, sir," Edward gestured to Franz and Klaus. "These men are Wehrmacht medics. They're prisoners now. They deserve protection under Geneva." Henderson studied the 2 Germans. Then he nodded. "They'll get it." He turned to his men. "Secure the area. Get these wounded to the aid station. And someone get this crazy British medic a hot meal and a warm bed." But Edward shook his head. "I can't leave yet, sir. Some of these men are too critical to move. I need to stabilize them first." Henderson stared at him. "Soldier, when was the last time you slept?" Edward couldn't remember. "I'll sleep when they're stable, sir." Henderson grabbed his shoulders. "You'll sleep now, that's an order. Your men need you alive, not dead from exhaustion." Edward wanted to argue, but his legs buckled. Henderson caught him before he fell. "Get him to a tent," Henderson ordered. "Under guard if necessary. He doesn't touch another patient for 12 hours. They carried Edward to a medical tent and put him on a cot. He tried to protest, but his body had other ideas. The moment he lay down, consciousness left him like a light switching off. He woke 36 hours later in a field hospital. Not the monastery, somewhere else, warmer. The smell of antiseptic and coffee filled the air. A nurse sat beside his cot, reading a book. When she saw his eyes open, she smiled. "Welcome back, Private Bennett. You've been asleep for a day and a half." Edward's voice was a croak. "The wounded, the Americans at the monastery, are they safe?" the nurse said gently. "All of them. You saved them." Edward closed his eyes. Relief flooded through him like morphine. "Where am I?" "Field hospital near Bastogne. You were brought here Christmas Eve." Christmas Eve. Edward had lost track of days. "What's the date?" "December 26th, 1944. His discharge date had been December 20th. He'd missed it. The war that was supposed to be over for him had dragged him back in, and he'd stayed, by choice. Major Pemberton appeared beside the cot. He looked older than Edward remembered. "You absolute madman," Pemberton said, but his voice was warm. "What you did, there aren't words." "I just did my job, sir." "No," Pemberton said firmly. "Your job ended December 20th. What you did after that was something else entirely." He pulled out a folder. Inside were new papers. Not discharge papers. Commendation papers. Recommendation for the George Medal. For extraordinary bravery in saving lives under fire. "I didn't do it for medals, sir," Edward said quietly. I know, Pemberton replied. That's why you're getting one. Over the next days, Edward learned what had happened during the Battle of the Bulge, the massive German offensive, the siege of Bastogne, the brutal winter fighting, over 19,000 Americans killed, 47,000 wounded. But the German gamble had failed. The Bulge was being pushed back. The Wehrmacht was retreating. Germany was truly beaten now. Among the survivors were the 90 men from the monastery. Word of their survival spread through the army. Newspaper correspondents came to interview Edward. "How did you do it?" they asked. "How did you keep them alive?" Edward didn't know how to explain. The cold, the fear, the constant work. Franz and Klaus helping, the strange brotherhood that formed between enemies when the only goal was keeping men alive. "We just endured," he finally said. "All of us together." The reporters loved it. "British medic saves 90 in Bulge battle," the headlines read. Letters started arriving from the families of the men he'd saved. Thank you notes, photographs. One mother sent him a scarf she'd knitted. Another father sent cigars. A young wife sent a picture of her newborn son, named Edward in his honour. He kept them all, every letter, every photograph. Proof that what he'd done had mattered. In January, the war entered its final phase. The Allies crossed into Germany. The end was coming, but Edward's war had already ended. On January the 15th, he was formally discharged. Medical grounds, effective immediately. This time, he went. The journey home began on a cold morning. He was put on a transport ship with other wounded, men missing limbs, eyes, pieces of their souls. The crossing was rough. Atlantic storms battered the ship. But after the Bulge, after the monastery, a little rough weather felt like nothing. When the ship reached England, it was snowing. Edward stood on deck, watching the white cliffs appear through the grey, and felt something crack inside him. Relief, grief, exhaustion, everything he'd been holding back for months. Mary was waiting at the port. She saw him coming down the gangway, thin and limping, and ran to him. They held each other in the snow, both crying, both unable to speak. "I thought you were coming home in September," she finally said. "I was," Edward whispered. "But some men needed me." "Did you save them?" "Most of them. Not all." She pulled back to look at his face. "You did enough, Edward. You did more than enough." But he wasn't sure that was true. At night, he dreamed of the 11 men he couldn't save. Their faces haunted him, the infections he couldn't stop, the bleeding he couldn't control, the cold that stole life despite his best efforts. "You can't save everyone," the army psychiatrist told him during debriefing. "You need to accept that." "I know," Edward said, "but that doesn't make it easier." The psychiatrist prescribed rest, routine, time. Said the nightmares would fade. They didn't. Not for years. Edward found work at a hospital in Liverpool. Civilian medicine. Broken bones, appendicitis, pneumonia. Nothing like the battlefield. Nothing like the monastery. But the skills transferred, the steady hands, the calm in crisis, the knowledge that sometimes keeping someone alive is about endurance more than treatment. He never talked about the war. Not to colleagues, not to friends. Only Mary knew. She'd wake in the night to find him sitting by the window, staring at nothing, and she'd sit beside him without speaking. Presence was enough. In 1947, he received an invitation, a reunion of the men from the monastery. They'd formed an association, the Ardennes 90, named for the 90 who survived. They met once a year. These men who'd been wounded together, saved together, who'd endured the coldest winter of the war in a frozen monastery with a British medic who wouldn't leave. Edward didn't want to go. "I'm not American," he told Mary. "It's their reunion, not mine." "You saved their lives," she said. "You're part of their story." So he went. The reunion was held in New York City. Edward took a ship across the Atlantic. The same ocean he'd crossed in uniform 3 years earlier. Different ship, different man. When he arrived at the hotel where the reunion was being held, he almost turned around, but then someone shouted, "That's him! That's Bennett!" And suddenly he was surrounded by men, Americans in civilian clothes, former GIs. They shook his hand, hugged him, thanked him. Some were crying. One man, a sergeant who'd lost both legs, rolled up in a wheelchair. "You held my hand while I was screaming," he said. "Told me I'd be okay. I didn't believe you, but you were right." Another man, the GI who'd collapsed at Edward's feet that first day, said, "I have 3 kids now. 3 kids who exist because you kept me alive." Captain Henderson was there too, older but still carrying himself like a soldier. "Bennett," he said gruffly, "you never did take that 12 hours of sleep I ordered." "I took 36, sir," Edward replied. They both laughed. That night the Ardennes 90 held a dinner. They invited Edward to sit at the head table. When it was time for speeches, Henderson stood. "Most of us wouldn't be here without this man," he said, gesturing to Edward. "He stayed when he could have left, worked when he could have rested, saved us when we were dying. I don't know what you call that. I just call it the best of humanity." The room erupted in applause. Edward sat there, overwhelmed, as 90 men and their families stood and clapped. For him, for what he'd done, for the choice he'd made in a frozen monastery while German tanks rolled past. Later, alone in his hotel room, Edward took out his discharge papers. The ones dated December 20th, 1944. The ones he'd kept in his breast pocket through everything. He'd carried them through the Battle of the Bulge like a talisman. A reminder that he'd had a choice, that he could have left, that he'd chosen to stay. He refolded them carefully and put them back in his wallet, where they'd stay for the rest of his life. Years later, when Edward was old and his children asked about the war, he told them about the monastery, about Franz and Klaus, about the 100 men in the snow, about the choice between safety and duty. "Why did you stay?" his daughter asked. Edward thought for a long time. Finally, he said, "Because leaving would have meant living with the question of what happened to them. And I couldn't do that. I couldn't go home and wonder every day if they died, because I wasn't there." "But you could have died," his son said. "Yes," Edward agreed. "But I didn't, and 90 men lived, and that has to mean something." In 1994, 50 years after the Battle of the Bulge, the last reunion of the Ardennes 90 was held. Only 30 of them were still alive. Edward, now 77, made the journey one more time. They gathered at a memorial in Belgium, near where the monastery had stood. It had been destroyed in later fighting, rebuilt as a church. A plaque on the wall read, "In memory of those who endured, December 1944. The old soldiers stood in the cold, remembering. One of them, a man named Wilson, who'd been 19 in the monastery, turned to Edward. "Did you ever regret it? Staying?" Edward looked at the faces around him. Old men now, but in his mind, still young GIs bleeding in the snow. "Every day," he said honestly, "and never." "How can it be both?" Wilson asked. "Because regret and purpose can exist together," Edward said. "I regret the men I couldn't save, the 11 who died, the years of nightmares, but I don't regret staying. That choice defined my life, made me who I am." He paused. "Sometimes the things that hurt us most are also the things that make us most human." They stood in silence, these old men, as snow began to fall, soft and gentle. Nothing like the brutal cold of 1944, but cold enough to remember. As Edward walked back to the car, he felt the familiar ache in his side, the shrapnel that never came out, the pieces of Normandy beach he'd carried for 50 years. It hurt. It always hurt. But it reminded him he was alive, that he'd survived when so many hadn't, and that his survival had meant something. Because 90 men went home to their families, Because 3 kids existed who wouldn't have. Because in the darkest winter of the war, in the coldest place, when death seemed certain, one man with discharge papers in his pocket chose to stay, not because he was brave, not because he was special, but because someone had to, and he happened to be there.